Welcome to the Jersey Justice Podcast, featuring your hosts, attorneys Gerald Clark and Mark Morris.
Allan, thanks for coming. We talked off the before the podcast a bit. Just so people know how I came to know Allan Canner. I think it was back in like 2000 or 2001. I had only been a lawyer for like 3 years or so. And we worked on a case together called Cooper Tire. And it was this class action case. And, I was a young lawyer and we worked together on this case. You were national counsel coordinating the whole thing. And I was absolutely amazed by, you as a lawyer. Allan's like the smartest lawyer I've one of the smartest lawyers I've come to know. He's definitely the smartest lawyer I knew back then. And you've always been, we talked about this yesterday a little bit, you've always been like a mentor to me, whether you know it or not. I learned so much from you. And a big thing I learned is like the quality, having a quality product. When I first clerked for a judge, a lot of the plaintiffs' presentation wasn't really as good as the defense presentation. I just figured how that always was. And when we did stuff together, our presentations based on, your leadership were like pristine. So it's cool. Anyway, I appreciate you being here and doing this.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. So tell the audience, if you don't mind. I mean, we could just go a little bit kind of chronologically, like where you grew up. The other thing, so people know, is Allan Canner is a well-known national attorney. He's handled a lot of environmental pollution cases, mass tort cases, class action cases throughout the country, and has gotten amazing results. He's a law school professor at Tulane, is it? Yeah. And just
Well, I
super
taught
well-known.
at Tulane for 18 years, but I also taught complex litigation at Yale 1 year when my nieces were undergrads. It's kind of a twofer. Texas, and I taught at Duke for 4 years with Francis McGovern.
Yeah.
Late Francis McGovern.
That's
Great
awesome.
guy.
Tell us like where you grew up, how you kind of came about. We like to talk to a lot of guys that we have on, guys and gals, how they got to where they are today. So if you could just tell us a little bit like, about your upbringing and how it led you all to this career.
Well, okay. So I always tell people I grew up in Vineland, New Jersey, but actually that's putting on airs a little bit. I grew up in Elmer in West Atlantic County for about 5-6 years on a chicken farm my parents had. Then we moved to Vineland, which was really, the big deal at the time, and went to public school. My parents were both Holocaust survivors from Europe, and so after the war, a lot of people were put in deportation camps, and then you play lottery, which country you're going to end up in. Like, you're going to go to Israel, you go to U.S. I have a lot of Canadian and Australian cousins, but a lot of both of my parents initially went to New York City, but
Let me just, when you say they're Holocaust survivors, what do you mean by that? Were they?
They were not in camps.
Right.
They were in the woods, partisans, underground. My dad and his brothers kind of had a gang. They were tough guys, I guess. My grandfather was tough. My dad, who I thought was tough, said about my grandfather, he's like, oh, he sweated testosterone, I mean, he was.
What country?
Poland.
Oh, okay, got it.
Okay, but it was in the part of Poland at the time that included a lot of what today is Ukraine. So they were in a Polish-Ukrainian areas. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, my parents, even that my father was an orphan, he and his brothers and sisters were orphans, but my mother's family was pretty well-to-do. I mean, she spoke Russian, German, Polish, Ukrainian. I mean, in America, you grow up, you're pretty much one language person. So they were, they had a kind of independent streak, both of them, in a way that maybe people who went through the camps had a very different experience. But
So what did they do during the war? Did they
lived in the woods with guns.
Wow, holy crap!
And
And it was an underground thing.
yeah, my dad's side, my
Yeah.
mother's side was more. They hid more than they stole food and
Also
things
in
like
Poland.
that. Also in Poland,
Wow.
different areas. They didn't know each other then. My mother was very young. Actually, the big action was after as the war was starting to end. So you're in Poland, and the Russians are coming in, and you know that the U.S. troops are on the other side, and there's Germany in between who want to kill you. And a lot of people in my father's village and my mother's village said, we don't want to be captured by the Russians. I mean, they thought the Russians were just evil. And so at the end of the war, they probably both did the hardest thing, which was to go from the Russian territory, cross the German lines, and try to get captured by Americans. That was the golden ticket at the time, was getting captured by Americans.
Wow.
And which is why, we all love this country so much.
So how old was your dad during that time? Roughly.
He was the youngest brother and sister. He was, I guess, from about 12 to 14, 15. When he got to the States, they were in the DP camps for a couple of years. He was probably 19, 20. A lot of that was, you had to have relatives. He actually had a distant cousin in Atlantic City who had a hotel, and he had another cousin in New York. So they kind of vouched for him to get him in. My mother's family was sent to Omaha, Nebraska, and my grandfather, immediately found the train station and went to New York City because he wasn't going to take anything like that. But Baron de Hirsch Foundation actually gave people in South Jersey, Jews, money for chicken farms. And so then Ralston Purina, this feed company, would give you baby chicks if you would sign a long-term contract for Ralston Purina products, which actually turned out to be a scam. Because it would just jack the prices up, and everybody's an immigrant; they're afraid of going to get sent back to Europe or something. Right. And so the chicken industry didn't last a long time in South Jersey, but it was a great place to grow up. I'd say a lot of the cousins all lived in Vineland at the time, and so went to public school. Thought about. I guess I tested well, so I went to UPenn, I guess because I tested really well on those PSATs and SATs. I guess I knew when I got my PSAT results back, it was like a perfect score, and I'm like, okay, I'm good for college.
When you say it was like a perfect score, what do you mean? It was actually a perfect score. So wait a second. So in high school, you aced the SAT or the PSAT. That's amazing.
I was not the crazy have to be first in my class. I never really cared about things like valedictorian or things like that. It was, but I tested well, and I was able to use that to my advantage, I guess, and got into a good school. And I thought I was going to be a math major, but then I ended up thinking, and I took a course in logic from the philosophy department, and then I took another class in like moral philosophy, and I thought, this is really neat stuff, like normative theory, which actually ended up helping me when I became a young lawyer. Normative theory is the idea of like how are rules structured, like in a chess, or etiquette. And how do you fill gaps where the rules don't quite give you an answer? And it was interesting when I first started practicing law. I'm jumping ahead briefly, but it was a 3 Mile Island case, and there really was no rule for how to handle a case like that. And I had this epiphany that if you understood complex litigation, federal practice especially, if you understood torts, not just sore neck, but just the history of torts, and if you understood environmental law and regs, and you could somehow merge the three together, there's real opportunity to do some real good. And I think I was one of the first people who picked up on that in the 3 Mile Island case, and then sort of took it to other toxic cases. But I do owe a lot of people say, oh, I've written like maybe 100 articles, and people say, oh, very creative. But a lot of it's just basic normative theory, going back to, I actually thought I would, when I finished Penn, I went to Harvard grad school in philosophy, and I thought I was going to be a philosophy professor. And I was giving, to prepare, I studied under a guy named John Rawls, who's probably the greatest moral philosopher of the 20th century. I was very lucky to do that. I thought that was going to be my life. I was happy with it. I like mental stimulation and creativity. And I don't know, I guess to prepare you to teach, they would have like the grad students do little seminars, and so I had a 3-part seminar on normative theory. And there were a bunch of like old guys in the back of the room who turned out to be law professors. And that's kind of how I got interested in going to law school. Not necessarily to practice law. I thought I was going to teach. Like when I thought I was going to teach. And so I went from the philosophy grad school to Harvard Law School. Then if you want to teach, you want to clerk for a fancy federal judge. So I clerked for this guy, Robert Vance, who's an awesome judge. Back then it was the Fifth Circuit. He was in Alabama. The court always would meet in New Orleans, but he was a great mentor in my life because, I grew up, I say I grew up poor. I mean, there wasn't money around, but it's not like you missed a meal or anything. It was just, you wore the same pair of shoes until your feet grew out of them, and wore my brother's clothes. Yeah, I mean, that kind of poor.
Poor or low class in America is living high in the hog in a lot of other countries.
Exactly. It was always like, we never heard about the kid in China who wasn't getting food. It was just like, this is better than Europe, I remember, I'll tell you one year, my one European story is like, so we did this car trip to New England to see where the Mayflower was. And we're walking around and they had these old Mayflower houses and the tops were like, branches and shit. Yeah. And I looked at it and I thought, how could people live like that? And I turned to my dad and I said, you see that roof? He's like, oh yeah, it's like the one I had in the house I grew up in.
Yeah.
But
I mean, you think today like, oh, I'm just gonna get a crappy a Toyota Celica, or I don't even know a Civic, a Toyota Civic, or Honda Civic. If you had a Honda Civic, that equivalent car in 1960 or 70, it's like being in a rocket ship.
I know. I had a Chevy Nova when I first started practicing law, but which was not such a great car. Though apologies to the Chevrolet Corporation. I think. Yeah, so I clerked for this judge, and it was like my year abroad program, living in Alabama after growing up in South Jersey, and then going to Ivy League schools. It was a good change, but he had been a trial lawyer and the head of the Democratic Party in Alabama. He was famous for fighting with George Wallace and whatnot, and I remember my last year of clerking. 3 Mile Island happened, and he's like, "Oh, you should go up there. You should." And you come out of Harvard, you've never drafted a document, you've never done a client interview. I mean, nowadays it's kind of nice. They have all these clinics at law schools. Kids can get a little practice.
Yeah.
But back then, you just basically came out, took the bar exam. I mean, even the bar exam was an eye opener for me. I mean, at Harvard, everything was like theory.
Right.
Oh, contracts are dead. Well. Yeah, that's what the academics say, but in fact, contracts are enforced every day in America, and you need to know the rules. And I loved studying for the bar exam. That was great. Because I was learning all this stuff I'd never heard about before. But he had been a plaintiff's lawyer, and before he became a judge, and he was a very creative guy. And so I hadn't really been exposed to anybody like this before.
Who was he appointed by?
Jimmy Carter.
Okay.
I mean, actually, when I was thinking of clerking, I had a pretty good record at law school, and there were all these famous judges, like feeder judges to the Supreme Court. And I went and saw a couple of them. I interviewed with them, and it was horrible. I mean, you'd go into chambers, and you wouldn't even meet the judge. It was like the law clerks, and they would bring out a notebook. These are the rules of procedure in our office.
Yeah.
And I would just sit there and think, like, I'd blow my brains out with this kind of. So I was reading about some of his appointments, and he had appointed two really progressive guys, Robert Vance, and there was a guy, Gilbert Merritt, out of Nashville, Sixth Circuit.
Who had appointed Carter?
Carter.
Okay, got it.
And he appointed some really good judges. He was like the first president to realize the importance of diversity and on the bench and whatnot. And so I clerked for him, and he was like this really creative plaintiff's lawyer. And he had all these really great ideas. And he said to me one day, he says, this 3 Mile Island thing seems kind of interesting. It's like, and I said, well, yeah, but I said, if I don't get to clerk on the Supremes, I think I'm going to just take one of these teaching jobs.
So was 3 Mile, was that like a vacation place in the Caribbean or something, 3 Mile Island? Like,
No, it was near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, the exact opposite of a vacation place. And there was this nuclear reactor, and it started melting down. And it was massive evacuation, massive amounts of
What does that mean when a reactor melts down? Just the water that cools the rods somehow goes away, and then the rods aren't cooled anymore? Like, what is that?
Yeah, that's exactly what it is. And then after the rods are used, they have to be kept in cold water for 5 to 15 years before they can go into these cast, these metal containers where they'll sit for the rest of eternity. Because, and actually, today the Supreme Court granted cert on on a radiation case that I did that sort of takes me back to my roots at 3 Mile Island.
So wait, they granted cert on the U.S. Supreme Court?
Yeah.
On a case that you're on?
Yeah.
Did you win in the circuit or lose in the circuit?
I won in the circuit. I did not want them to grant cert.
Okay.
But
because I was going to say congratulations, but I couldn't until I heard what the thing was.
No. I think I'm going to win big.
Uncongratulations on cert getting granted in that situation.
Well, yeah, my job was to not get cert, but it was, there's this, the nuclear power industry really put a lot of time and money into lobbying the Supreme Court with articles as to how important this case was. I mean, I have to tell you, like when I started practicing law, I hung out a shingle. This is part of the 3 Mile Island story. When I was first getting started, I did a few like anti-nuke cases, like Limerick Ecology Action was my case, and you could never beat the NRC on anything. They did whatever they wanted, no matter how irresponsible. They'd write these reports that said the odds of a reactor like 3 Mile Island ever malfunctioning are 1 in 20 trillion.
So the NRC was the Nuclear Regulatory Commission?
Yes.
And was it essentially captured by the energy industry or the nuclear industry?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they've been terrible in the United States. And so what happened was the Supreme Court, in a case called West Virginia, let me go back a step.
Let me go back one more step, though.
Okay.
A couple more steps. Did you, before you went to law school, or did you at some point take the MCATs to be a doctor, the doctor test?
I took a lot of tests, yeah. Why?
Do you remember how you did on the test to be a doctor?
I did very well. I did very well on the law one, and
I just remember because we had a dinner. You and I, we were at a dinner many years ago, and I'll never forget the story because we used to. So people know, this was back in like early 2000s when I'm working on this case with Cantor, Allan, and you know, my boss, later partner John Keefe, he'd be like, "All right, Cantor's coming into town." And the whole office would go into a buzz to get ready for Cantor to come into town, and it was always the funniest. You know, it was really fun. And I was working on the case, and I would prep super hard because I just wanted to do good. It's funny, like I ain't as smart as you. Like I'm relatively smart, but I was always fascinated by this whole thing, by your intelligence and how you would mastermind these cases. And so I just wanted to do well. But my thing is like, I'm just going to outwork everybody. You know, that was my way of kind of trying to get ahead or whatever. I'm just going to outwork them all. And I remember I was always the last one at the office. When I started out as a plaintiff's lawyer, I'd get to the office at like 9, 10 a.m. and I'd work till like 8, 9, 10 at night, 11, 12, 1 in the morning. And I remember we had married, and we had little babies at home, 1 or 2 babies. And it'd be like Saturday, I'm just going to go pick up some milk. It'd be 10 a.m. And I'd end up coming back at 4 because I'd swing by the office. And I just remember those days, Allan. It was just a lot of fun. It was fascinating for me. And I would have those especially long days when you were coming into town to argue a motion, to work on the case. But then it was also super fun because after we did the cases, we'd go to court, we'd get with the judge. I remember there was a big motion we had in front of Judge Lechner in federal court in Newark, and then we'd go out to these dinners after. I grew up, like you were saying, I was the youngest of 13 kids. I actually didn't go out to eat until I was probably 12 years old at my sister's wedding. The night before my sister's wedding was the first time I went out to dinner. Okay. So then when we'd go out to these dinners with Allan, they were super fun. This is a long way of it getting to the MCAT, which was, I remember one time at the dinner, you were telling the story about, you were like, yeah, I took the medical boards and like, I pretty much aced it. I was thinking of being a doctor. I'm like, Allan, you didn't ace the medical board. How did that? And you were like, yeah, there's always like a trick to the questions, you would say. Like there's a certain trick. Anyway, so what do you remember about the medical boards and taking these tests? Like,
there really is.
How does one ace those? Like, what is that?
No, it's like, it was weird. Like, I guess it happened in high school, when I took the PSAT. It was just like, it's just this thing, I can look at the question and I can see 4 answers and I just like, oh, this is the right one. But by the way it's written, I think I've always been really sensitive to language and nuance. I mean, it helps a lot with cross-examination, also helps with, telling a story to a jury. But I don't know. It was this thing. I don't know if it's changed. I never interfered with my kids preparing for any of those tests or whatnot. But it was just like you could look at it and tell kind of, if you knew a little something about it, it was all logic, I think. That's not really, I should probably go into competition with that Khan Academy place, huh?
Yeah.
Start like selling.
Hey, I just found it fascinating for someone that scored 910 on the LSATs, or the SAT, I scored 910, and that's the same scale it is today, so people know. But I took it again and scored 970, so I improved. All right, so let me get this straight. So you grew up chicken farmer, you go to the public high school, you basically ace the Scholastic Aptitude Test. You go to UPenn. You then go to Harvard Law School, clerk for
Harvard Philosophy, then Harvard Law.
And then, let me get this straight, you open up your own law firm as a solo practitioner and take on the nuclear industry? I think that's where you left off before.
Oh, yeah,
before
yeah.
we went on.
Well, no, some of my I was research assistant to Larry Tribe when I was at Harvard Law, a very famous constitutional law professor. In fact, Barack Obama subsequently had the job I had, which was his research assistant when he was a law student. And I thought I was going to teach. And so I didn't really make plans for working at a firm or anything. And the judge said to me, you really should take a look at this. This is like the stuff of history. the more I thought about it, as I said earlier, I realized, yeah, there's a lot of pieces that are floating around. They're going to finally come together. And this is not just, and at the same time, people were starting to talk about Superfund, which was passed in 1980, the following year. And they were talking about like, you'd see all these pictures every week in the newspaper about like 50,000 drums found, over an aquifer in Tennessee. And it was just like this madness with environmental problems. I mean, you grow up in South Jersey, you're not an environmentalist. I mean, you live in the country, it's nice. I mean, you don't really think about pollution and stuff. At least I hadn't. I'm sure there were some people who did, but for me, it was I realized something was going to happen, and there really was no place to go. And so what the judge did was he explained to me how you set up a practice. You get criminal appointments. That'll pay your light bill. You do a little work you try to get into like a suite, and maybe you can do some work for some of the other lawyers. And he said, go to Harrisburg. He says, go to all the personal injury firms there. Go door to door. Tell them you went to Harvard. Tell them to put up the money. Tell them to put up the case costs. Get the plaintiffs, and you'll do all the work, and you split it. And ideally, you'll split it 50-50, but they may jam you a little bit on the cost. So I thought, well, yeah, why not? I mean, it's kind of nice, And I worked on one case with a lot of other firms, including Berger and Montague, and I got to argue medical monitoring for the first time. In other words, if you're a bad guy and you expose people to a dangerous substance, you have a right to medical monitoring. That was a big breakthrough. That was a certified class.
And that's basically where you've been exposed to, say, a chemical or a pollution, and these are the 5 chemicals, and studies show that in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, you're at risk for these diseases. And if they catch the diseases early, they can better treat them. So therefore, the medical monitoring is where you'll go to doctors and get certain tests regularly to watch out. That's
yeah? I mean, at that point in time, there were 2 rules. There was one that said you can't recover for increased risk of harm, and the other was you have to manifest the injury. Well, that may make sense if you're talking about like, I don't know, auto torts or something. But when you're talking about chemicals that have latent effects like 5, 10, 15 years down the road, it seems like from a society point of view that you're better off like mitigating the bad consequences and making the bad guys sort of pay for whatever those transaction costs are associated with that. And we came up with a really good medical monitoring program. In that case, it was new and it was contentious. One of the things that I really like about it, though, was certain things you could not cure in the future, but you could help people develop better lifestyles. So some money went into prenatal care. I ended up representing about 18 first trimester birth defect cases. That's personal injury, not medical monitoring. And we did very well with those after 2-3 years of starving on court appointments and whatever else I could find. But by then I was kind of hooked. At first I thought, I'll do this for a year or 2, and then I'll go back to academia or something. And but it's just like every day there was something new and exciting that was going on, or that really caught, like Cooper Tire.
What was 3 Mile Island, though? So just so people know, like what was the liability? What was the damage? What went wrong? Why did it go wrong? And what happened to people as a result?
Back in the day, there was a big Jane Fonda movie on 3 Mile Island, but it was a reactor. It suffered a meltdown because of a series of events that they should have been prepared for, but weren't. And it caused a massive release of radioactive gas from the Harrisburg facility. Actually, there were two. There was 3 Mile Island 1 and 3 Mile Island 2. 1 was the one that went down, and 2 is still there. And they're talking about restarting it because apparently AI needs a lot of energy, and Microsoft or Amazon wants to buy it as a power source, which is crazy. But so then this big cloud went in the northeast direction towards New York. Well, all of the people who were under the cloud, like what was their health effects? It turns out that after we bombed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, in Japan, they set up these epidemiological studies. It was called the ABCC studies. And of all of the medical problems, all of the hazardous chemicals or energy that you could be studying, there's more epidemiological data associated with radiation than almost anything else. And it was great data, and there were certain types of birth defects that were tied in. There were certain types of adult problems that were tied in. So we had very, very strong science. I think people generally felt like we did a good job for the community. There were also like economic harm issues. I mean, Hershey chocolate, for example, they weren't going to sell their chocolate. I mean, because all the cows had gotten exposed and they had radioactive milk, and we have your milk chocolate. So they actually took some off. They basically disposed of it. So there were economic harms in the community as well as the personal injuries. So I was more focused on personal injury issues, so that was really the start of it. And then professionally,
But hold on, let me ask you.
one of the reasons you hang out a shingle is because nobody else wants to do what you want to do at the time.
That's why I wanted to ask you, when you graduated Harvard, the law school, did you have loans? Did you have like college
No,
loans?
I had a full boat scholarship to Harvard.
So why didn't you go to some big firm and start making $1 gazillion at some big corporate firm or something? Is that something that you considered or people talked about? Or
I went on some interviews with big firms, mostly to get a free meal and trip to someplace, and but I was never serious about that. I figured I was going to be an academician. But one of the things that was really interesting to me was you go to these big firms, like in these high rises in New York or whatever, and maybe it was like Jones, blah, and blah, blah, blah. Well, so you go talk to all these people who you had no respect for, like worms, weasels, major partners in firms. And then they say, oh, Mr. Jones is here. He'd like to see you because he's like senior, like retired. And he's like the most interesting guy in the whole building, right? He's the guy who one day said, I'm going to hang out a shingle and start practicing. Right. And then he hired all these people who had no spines, and they've taken over the
what's
firms.
That firm, Wickersham and Taft? What is that? It's some big New York firm. It's but Taft was President Taft.
Yeah. I mean, there's some of the older guys were really cool. I remember I was trying a case, and there was this big firm on the other side, and one of the managing partners came by because I was kicking their butt pretty good, and we started talking. And he was like a New York. He was like a guy from New York. He started his practice with the other guy. They were representing hookers, getting him out of jail, and petty criminals. And then eventually they got this book of business, and they started growing. And then they became this national antitrust firm. And I love those two guys. They were great. But what happens is very often people, I don't know, they replace themselves, not with the person like me could never, I couldn't go into a firm with 100,000 rules and regulations, and it just wasn't me.
Did you have, when you graduated law school, did you have long hair?
Yeah.
So was it long hair ponytail? What was
Well, I mean,
were you into the hippie thing, or what year did you
graduate?
No. What year did you graduate college or high school?
I graduated high school in '73. I graduated Penn in '75.
Yeah.
I spent '76 at Harvard philosophy, and then '79 I graduated the law school.
Yeah.
It's our 45th year, I graduated with Chief Justice Roberts. You know, he always wanted to cheat off of me in exams, but I wasn't going to let him get away with that kind of stuff.
Just so everyone knows, Allan is not kidding that he actually graduated with the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, Roberts.
Yeah, he you know, and he's had some success as well in his career. I don't know that he's done as much good for other people. You know, I think, you know, one of the great things about 3 Mile Island and the course I took was we were making law at a time when people were trying to figure out how to really grapple with. I once wrote an article saying, you know, the industrial age is so different than, you know, the dog bite cases, the car crash cases. You know, you're talking about chemicals that get into people's bodies, into the environment, cause latent injuries. Like, how do we as a society decide when you're harmed, what is a harm, and what does justice require you to do to solve that problem? And so that was a very exciting time. And I remember after I cashed my big check from 3 Mile Island, which was based on getting people millions of dollars for their children's birth defects, a lot of people said, "Oh, we got more cases for you, Allan." And I made a choice. I said, you know, I don't want to be a 3 Mile Island lawyer. I want to be part of this new transformation that we're dealing with in terms of mass torts and environmental problems and whatnot. And so after that, I gave a lot of speeches because it was, you know, it's kind of interesting to folks what happened. But that got me some visibility. I ended up doing Hyde Park Bloody Run, which is right next to Love Canal. And I made some good law in New York State, and I did an Aerojet General cases in California, and pretty much early on was primarily doing environmental work. We also eventually started doing more class actions and then consumer products. That's how we met, I guess, through Cooper Tire. But I think it was, you know, it's always that the road not taken or the road taken. Like, I probably could have kept doing 3 Mile Island things, but I always want to challenge myself. And so I ended up doing all these cases. Like, for example, the case that they granted cert in the Supreme Court.
But so where's your office at this point? But keep talking. I just want to lower this air.
Yeah,
But go. Where's your office?
We have our main office is in New Orleans, Louisiana.
Yeah, but you're in Harrisburg, 3 Mile Island.
I was in Philly.
Oh, okay. Your office in Philly, and then at some point you moved. Tell me.
Yeah. So I was in Philly, and I started to achieve some success there. And I was giving a speech, and somebody said, introduced me to Cancer Alley, which is an area outside of Baton Rouge, lot of chemical plants in Louisiana, and started telling me the stories. You know, some small. A lot of this is environmental justice stuff. You know, poor Black communities living on fence lines with high levels of pollution or contaminants, poison in their bodies, and not really having a lot of choice. And I thought those.
Let me ask you a question. When you say there's poor, you know, that you saw in Black communities living on fence lines, what you mean is they're living basically on the line of a plant, some kind of a plant or something. Can I ask you? Let me ask you. Because I've heard about this in the South. Is it just? Have you seen? Is it just random that there's poor communities living on fence lines, or is there something more to that, as far as you know?
Oh, was it intentional?
Yeah, like I've heard that a lot, where there's actually urban planning had been done where let's put the poor people here, there. Have you seen any of that or anything like that?
Yeah.
In your experiences?
Yeah. But at the time, I wasn't really thinking about how it got to be that way. Like, so for example, you know, after the Civil War, Blacks were given pieces of land, like between plantations. And then these plantations sold off to these petrochemical companies who then started building these plants, and people had no place else to go. And so they were sort of stuck there. And you'd find these like one street villages with a church at the end, and everybody living on both sides of the street, mostly family, but it was their community. You know, it's like, okay, you're a woman, you're single, you have 2 kids. Well, your auntie's living on the street, right? She can take care, she can help you with childcare. You can go drive someplace for your job. I mean, this was their home, and they were nice homes and whatnot. But, you know, they, you know a little bit about chemistry, but these volatile organics, we would draw blood from children, and it would still be in their body. And I remember looking at a plant. I was suing. I don't know whether it was Georgia Gulf or Georgia Pacific, but they had the exact same plant in upstate New York, and it was like 155 times the amount of pollution came out of this one in Louisiana, because in New York they were regulating. And we were, and I spent a couple of years and eventually moved to New Orleans because I liked Louisiana. It was nicer than Philly, I thought. And I know all the Philadelphians are coming for me.
I know.
I was thinking, okay, I don't have a car in the parking lot, so I'm okay.
You're not in Eagles territory, at least. We're in Giants territory this year.
Oh, so you like Eli Manning, right?
Yeah, of course.
My kids went to school with Arch Manning, the Texas quarterback.
Yeah, they're Louisiana people.
Yeah, New Orleans people. Big difference between New Orleans and Louisiana generally. But so we did these environmental justice cases for a few years, and I eventually, liked Louisiana, got to sue a lot of polluters.
Why do you have to sue polluters? I mean, didn't we have the EPA at that point? And, you said the New York plant's regulated. Why do we need, plaintiffs' lawyers, environmental lawyers? Doesn't the EPA take care of this stuff?
No, I think most Americans would agree that the EPA is probably understaffed, underfunded, and in a way, a big war right now between the Supreme Court and the rest of the country is what is the appropriate role of regulation. But the EPA was not tasked with stopping pollution as much as managing pollution, which makes them susceptible to things like capture. I mean, I always thought the best was that.
Can you explain capture?
Yeah.
I was listening to Bobby Kennedy Jr. on Joe Rogan's podcast. By the way, I don't know what happened to him. I liked him about a year ago. I don't know. It seems like he went the Rudy Giuliani route. But Bobby Kennedy did an excellent job of explaining capture. Can you explain what you know?
Yeah. Okay. Basically, the notion of capture is that the agency, because of inadequate resources, they rely on industry information. People who are in the agency, their highest and best job will be to leave the agency and go to work for the industry they're regulating, and then maybe come back as a political appointee to a higher office in that agency. And so their livelihood is really based on the well-being of the regulated industry, not on what's the public good require. And so capture refers to the fact that the perception of political scientists that the agency isn't really doing its job, and the diagnosis is, well, people care more about the regulated industry's well-being because that's where they see their future versus what the public interest requires. I think in Louisiana, the state government did very little at that time to protect people, as opposed to New York State, which did have some rules that were more aggressive than federal rules. You have to always deal with this federalism thing, but federalism thing being the allocation of power between state and federal governments. But it was immensely rewarding work. I really felt like, we would sue people. I think New York Times said it was the first time that anybody was getting justices back in the 80s, really, 80s and 90s. But it was good work because like you really felt you made a difference in people's lives. Like we would get enough money to recreate their town someplace else. Okay, and because there's no way the legal system is good about money, but they're not going to let you just shut down a big factory.
Right.
So you had to work it out, and it was very interesting. I mean, just the whole dynamics of what people were looking for in a new community and whatnot. So some of those cases were really good and important. And I think it was during those years, as I started my practice in Louisiana, I started also pivoting to doing some consumer class actions and whatnot. But it wasn't just poor people. I mean, a lot of real estate developers, I don't know if you know much about real estate development, but a lot of it involves borrowing a ton of money and trying to get a project done quickly. And they started, like people would just like dig a hole and find out it was contaminated. And then the government would say, you can't do any work, it's got to get cleaned up. And then the polluter would say, well, I can sue you because you're the owner now, even though this other company had generated all the hazardous waste that was now on this guy's property or gal's property. So I represented a lot of real estate people against chemical companies, people who were like, I mean, development is risky. I mean, a lot of these developers can go bankrupt and stuff, and
Those are big swings.
Big swings
with the
right. But if you get stopped and you can't do anything because of pollution, you got a big problem, and the bank's probably going to call the note, and so I would sort of come in and sue these people and try to get the judge to rush the case to trial. And it was great. It was great work. You kind of felt a little bit like a firefighter in those cases, moving things along. So, then, over years we started diversifying, doing some consumer class actions, cases like that.
When you did 3 Mile Island, was it just you and your firm, or did you have any?
Just me.
And then at what point did you hire lawyers and start to bring on people? Roughly.
So when I was in Philly, I had my big breakthrough. My big breakthrough was when I could afford an IBM Selectric. I had taken. I know how to type. I mean, I took typing in high school mostly to meet girls. But back then nobody knew about computers, right? You didn't really. But and I met a few girls, but I won't go into detail about that. But I did. Getting an IBM Selectric was a big deal, and then I got a part-time secretary, and then I had law clerks, and then I had a lawyer. But at some point, I actually had a pretty big office in Philly by the end. I probably had 8 or 9 lawyers. I was doing a lot of drug product cases. I had this case involving Zomax. Yeah, this was after 3 Mile Island. So Zomax was one of the first MDLs. It was a non-steroidal.
How many years are you out of law school at this point that you got nine lawyers under you, roughly?
4 or 5.
That's unbelievable.
And
the only people I've ever heard of that are that new of a lawyer, that have that big of a firm that early, is people that just grew up, with a lot of money, and the family just funded their firm, and they just dump $1 gazillion into advertising. But for someone to do it from the ground up like that, that's
yeah. And actually,
remarkable.
Back then, nobody was advertising. I mean, like
there was a stigma of it back then.
Yeah, I mean,
lawyer advertising,
and even today, I think it's good that people are informing. It's good that lawyers are informing people about their rights.
Yeah.
But I still haven't advertised. I mean, my business model was to get referrals, and so that's why I've always written a lot of articles, given a lot of speeches. People say, "Let's go to South Carolina trial lawyers." I'll go there, and like so. For example, Zomax. I had somebody said, "Oh, I have these two cases. They're no good." It was it was one of the first non-steroidals. In other words, alternative to aspirin. But at the time, it had this terrible effect, anaphylactic shock.
Oh, geez.
And they never really tested for it. It was like, so I started doing these cases, and I started talking about it in speeches, and then gradually, over the years, about 18 other lawyers referred cases to me, not just in Philly, but from around the country. I was one of those people, I made a big fee in 3 Mile Island, but I was just going to pour it all into the business. I mean, I really was not like, I didn't need a fancy car, I didn't need a fancy house. I was very happy. I had a little apartment, and my Chevy Nova. And
sounds like you missed that car. There's a certain sentimental thing I see in you when you talk about that Nova.
It was funny because I didn't really care about cars all that much. I remember that one guy once wanted to refer me a case, and he asked me, he's like, "What do you drive? Like a Mercedes or a BMW?"
Yeah.
And I looked at him. I said, "I drive a Chevy Nova. Why?" But it was a great car. Like if you lived in Philly, you could leave it on the street, not use it for 2 months,
Yeah.
and it would always start.
And it blend right in too.
Yeah, nobody would ever trash it or steal it. I mean,
Yeah.
If anything, you worried about it getting towed away and for being litter or something. But in any event, it was a good car, and it lasted a long time. But in terms of work, so the Zomax thing got going, and at first they were offering people like $10,000 for like this life-threatening thing, and by the end, the last couple of, I probably settled one for $100,000 on the eve of trial, and then $250,000, and you're getting these hot documents, and then whistleblowers started coming out. This was Johnson & Johnson. Whistleblowers started showing up with like all these hot memos as to how terrible this thing was, and it kept growing and growing and growing, and they finally paid my clients a ton of money for me to leave them alone. I remember one of the high points of my early career in Philly was there was a very famous plaintiff's lawyer, very good trial guy, and he represented a lot of the unions. So if a guy fell off a building and was seriously injured, he would do that. Or if a building collapsed, he would do those. I mean, he was the real deal, a good guy. And honestly, I think a lot of young lawyers who just hang out a shingle will tell you that it's the older guys that really teach you stuff over time, teach you about ethics, teach you about diligence, hard work, quality work. Any event, he says, "Oh, Allan," he says, "I know you're doing these drug cases with Zomax. I'm not going to bother with it. My guy fell off a 3rd-story building. He's in a full body cast at the hospital, and they gave him some Zomax, and he had an anaphylactic shock." And I was like, "Oh, is he still alive?" And they're like, "Yeah, it's transitory." He said, "If you want, you can have the case. Get whatever you can for it." And I remember that case sat till the very end when it was the big payday, and like everybody who'd gone through anaphylactic shock, some more serious than others. This guy, he honestly could remember very little about that event because of the other trauma.
Yeah.
But so I remember at the end of the case, his check was like $1.5 million or something, which back in the 80s was a lot of money.
Yeah.
So I remember going to, and I hadn't really kept up with this guy. I went over to his office, and I'm like, "Here's your check," And he looked at it, and he's like, the eyes in his head are like spinning around. And I said, "You don't think that's enough?" And no, I wanted this guy's approval, know? And I was like, and he's like, "You got more money for, 15 minutes of anaphylactic shock than I got for falling off a 4-story building." Yeah. And I was like, really? I felt pretty good about myself.
Yeah,
That's when
yeah.
I knew that,
Yeah.
I could handle anything.
Yeah.
No, but I think everybody in law, they have moments where, their self-confidence moves to the next level,
Yes.
or even like, in the first couple of years of practice, I never lost a trial, but then I finally lost one. And it was like, in a way, it was great because you learn so much more when you think about why did I lose it? How could I have done things differently?
Right.
Than when you win, you just get a swollen head. It's like I remember after 3 Mile Island, I was giving some speeches and my dad was talking to some of his friends and they were over at the house, I think playing cards one Friday night or something.
Yeah.
And they're like, "Oh, we hear you're an expert, Allan." I'm like, "Well, I said, not really. I give some speeches." My dad's like, "Oh, he's an expert because he tells everybody he's an expert." Sort of blew my cover. But, so we were doing a lot of the drug product cases, but that was a little bit, I didn't like that part of my life because it was almost like a mill,
Yeah.
Just like you're just turning over cases. You're not really, you're helping people, but you're not changing the world in the way some of these other cases, like maybe 3 Mile Island,
Right.
or Hyde Park Bloody Run. I've always gravitated towards novel cases. Like I get a lot of calls from lawyers who are like, "This case sounds crazy. There may be something here. If anybody can figure it out, it's you.
Yeah.
Take a look at." Or a new spin, like Cooper Tire was just basically poorly manufactured tires, which historically are litigated one by one,
Yeah.
right? I had the idea to turn it into a class action, and so if you have an auto accident and your tire is suspected, they'll give you the production data for that week because that's all that's relevant.
Yeah.
Production of the tire. But when you bring a class action, the judges started giving me access to all the tires, all the production data, and you could show that the company knew that it was manufacturing substandard tires. So we sort of took that game and flipped the script on the other side, and really it was transformative because the company was caught, and we were able to, by reformulating it as a class action versus individual cases, get a better result. And I think a lot of, like the case that the Supreme Court granted today was a couple of oil companies who I always end up suing, came to me. They were going to build a 150,000 metric ton of high-level radioactive waste on the Permian Basin. The Permian Basin's where all the oil and gas in the United States is really coming from right now. Department of Defense calls the Permian Basin essential to American energy security. And it was a weird interview because they're like, "We hate you." And I'm like, I said, well, they said, "You're probably going to sue us, but for something else. But you're a good lawyer, and we want you to try to go after the NRC." And I told them at the interview, I said, "You're never going to beat the NRC." I said, "I started with 3 Mile Island. These guys have the whole system rigged." And it turned out I was wrong about that.
So wait, what did they want to do on the Permian Basin?
Okay, so
Where is it located?
Permian Basin is on the border of Texas and New Mexico.
Okay.
Okay, it's where a lot of oil and gas comes from. The NRC got the idea that what it should do is allow for interim storage. We have a bunch of nuclear power plants in this country.
Yeah.
They all generate radioactive waste. Historically, it's all been stored on site. Congress, under the Atomic Energy Act, Congress passed something called Nuclear Waste Policy Act, the idea of which was to deal with final finally getting rid of all of this stuff and storing it in a mountain,
like in a
Nevada.
central location.
Yeah.
They'll put it in the middle of a mountain.
Right.
Right.
And that was a good plan. But for whatever reason, politics or whatever, they could never approve it. And one of the things Congress said that was smart was, we don't like interim storage, because if there's interim storage, nobody's ever going to vote for a final solution, a
Right.
permanent solution.
Right.
And the permanent solution is supposed to be, according to the International Atomic Energy Agency, which the NRC is a member of and the U.S. participates in, is like a deep hole in the ground that's waterproof and whatever, and then just bury it. And so the NRC, in its wisdom, rather than working towards that goal, says, oh, we'll let private companies, not Department of Energy or anybody, we'll let private companies do interim storage of like over 100,000 cubic, tons of high-level radioactive waste that basically in Texas, they were going to put in like these caskets, lead caskets, after they cooled off in waters, and put them on the ground, on the surface of the earth. And in an area, by the way, which is susceptible to earthquakes, there's sinkholes, and it's just like the worst place in the world. And it's like, are you kidding me? Like, why would you, send it to some place where there's nothing going on?
Yeah.
And actually, the rules are that you should never store high-level radioactive waste where there's a secondary use of property. You don't want to have conflicting land use issues. But they ignored it. And I said I thought we would lose, but I'd love the chance to go after them.
So you're representing
The oil companies.
Suing the NRC to prevent this taking of the Permian Basin area.
Right.
Got
So one of the things that happened,
And so the NRC petitioned the Supreme Court to take the case?
yes.
Wow. Okay.
So they lost big time. They could have left it alone and gone and just said, we're going to put all this in another circuit, because this was the Fifth Circuit, the Southern United States.
Yeah.
They could have said, okay, now we're going to move all this to, I don't know, someplace where life is cheap, Cleveland, I don't know, someplace like that. But they didn't. They decided to take it on appeal. But a lot has happened. Okay, so for your listeners, administrative law, which is what governs federal agencies, it really didn't exist in any meaningful way prior to FDR and the New Deal, which started from the premise that we should have expert agencies manage certain problems, and that was a good instinct. But over the years, you've had less expertise, more capture. In addition, Congress, when it's dysfunctional, doesn't really pass very clear laws.
Right.
So the agencies jump in, and the courts defer to whatever the agency says. The agency says, this is called Chevron deference in part.
Yeah.
So they sit there and say, well, we think this is what is good, and the courts say, well, we think it's within the broad scope of their authority. The current Supreme Court, which is conservative, says, no, you got to pass laws clearly.
Right.
And so the first chink in the armor.
And that's what they used with the Civil Rights Act, right? The Voting Rights Act. That's how they started to poke holes in that recently.
Right. The Voting Rights Act stuff is a tragedy that should never have occurred. It's just horrible.
And just for voting rights, that's basically you have a state and they'll gerrymander the state, and let's say there's, African American communities throughout the state. They'll draw the congressional line to capture all the African Americans into one district so they get one congressman. And then all the other districts have a bunch more congressmen because the way they draw the lines. And then the Voting Rights Act said, you can't do that because it's racist, essentially.
Right. And
among other things, the Voting Rights Act.
But it basically ended up gutting the Voting Rights Act. It's
Right.
very hard to bring a Voting Rights Act case. I mean, if I if I were to retire tomorrow and just like, what would you want to do? I would probably want to write an article, among other things, about the Voting Rights Act and how it's totally fallen apart. But there are some good books and articles out there. In any event, 2 years ago, the U.S. Supreme Court, in a case called West Virginia versus EPA, said that for major questions, called the major question doctrine, for major questions, an agency can't make up a solution. They have to get some express authority from Congress. That's when I realized that I had a chance of winning this case, because the storage of high-level radioactive waste is a major question. The prologue to the Nuclear Waste Policy Act says as much, and that was our way of getting into this, was to just say that they didn't have legal authority.
That's the one thing, with the stuff going on today with, I'm trying to stay away from politics, because when I start talking politics, somehow YouTube, we don't get as much play, but it's so intertwined with justice and things that go on, so when you have politics and you have, conservatives and liberals, the courts in many ways are supposed to be insulated from all that, and it's supposed to be more of a pure function. So it's super interesting. And when you talk about how you got bored with the Fosamax cases, or those drug Zomax cases, because it was just redundancy, and you're not groundbreaking new areas to advance your view of social justice and doing good for society. So then when you have a conservative Supreme Court like we have now, and they interpret this administrative law to say that the government agencies, the EPA, name the agency, the Commerce Department, they don't have as much power as they do to interpret the law that the Congress passes and give their own spin on it. Instead, the conservative Supreme Court is saying that the Congress has to be more specific. They're not just going to delegate this to you. And the conservative Supreme Court did that in a case, the Voting Rights Act, to make the Voting Rights Act less strong, which is supposed to make equality in voting. But what's amazing, what you're doing is you're taking that ruling, because the judiciary is supposed to be kind of more about the law and pure, not conservative versus liberals, and you're actually using that to protect this basin, by saying, so because you could have a federal agency that says, for example, we're going to outlaw abortion. Well, wait a minute, where does the statute say that? It doesn't specifically say we're going to outlaw abortion. But you could have a conservative agency, or in a conservative administration, but you can use those same principles to advance your view of social justice.
You got to work with what you can work with.
Yeah.
We live in a time with the most conservative Supreme Court probably either in history, or at least since the 20s and 30s. And you got to work with what they give you to get a good result. I have for 40 years watched the NRC do what I think are incredibly stupid things. And to have an opportunity to say, is there something in the text of the statute that expressly allows them to do this? And say, no, there isn't. And have judges, conservative judges, agree and say, yeah, it's not there. Emperor has no clothes. And I think that's a great result. And you said, oh, so I guess you lost that they granted cert. But what I think is going to happen is that they made a mistake in doing that.